残念。
何の話だ。
運転。
勝手に採点するな。
クラウドはもっと上手いと思ったのに。
タンデムは慣れてない。
次、クラウドが後ろね。
嫌だ。
じゃあ次も私が後ろってことで。ん？ほら見えてきた。あそこから行くよ。
Hello everybody, and we can finally start talking about Final Fantasy VII. What a good day it is today. This is a game that has been many years in the making and has been right at the top of fans' list of things they would like to see done for many more years on top of that. And yes, review embargo has lifted. You can go and check out my review on digitallydownloaded.net right now. I apologise in advance, it's a long one. I've written about 2,500 words on it. There's a lot to talk about with regards to this game. And I want to say right up front, even if you don't read that review, I do recognise that a lot of people are going to take issue with this game on one way or another. It was pretty much inevitable, really. The thing with Final Fantasy VII is it has such a gravitas and it has such a reputation that has built around it over the last couple of decades that there was no way that Square Enix was going to be able to remake it in a way that wasn't going to upset somebody. The fact that it needed to be a remake because the original game is now really showing its teeth, and it wasn't just enough to have a visual upgrade, they also needed to modernise the gameplay systems in order to make it relevant to the modern era, meant that there were going to be a lot of people that were going to be put off by something to do with this game, whether it's the action combat system, the way that the levels are designed, the structure of the narrative, and plenty more besides. I do delve into all of that in my review, though. This video was not really there to be a review in itself. It's there to complement what I talk about in the review, and in particular talk about one thing that I absolutely love about Final Fantasy VII. This remake really got me in one particular way, and that is the characters. And particularly the way that it has taken characters that were so minor in the original release and actually made them really important and valuable parts of the storytelling experience. So that's what this video is going to be about. I also wanted to front end at the top of the video that as I am going to be talking about characters and narrative, it's inevitable that I'm going to mention some spoilers, and there is going to be some footage in here from the game that would be a narrative spoiler as such. What I have done is made sure that I've picked footage from the early part of the game so nothing too critical is spoiled, and of course I'm not going to mention those critical spoilers either. You can watch this video, go into the game, you'll know some scenes when they show up, but you're not going to have the future destiny of any of the characters ruined or any of the broader plot points. I've deliberately made it so that you can watch this one, and as long as you're not too sensitive about spoilers, you're not going to feel like I've gone and ruined the game on you. So the first thing to note is that I was not the biggest fan of Final Fantasy VII going into the remake. It was actually at the bottom of my list of favourite Final Fantasy games, and that is by no means to suggest that it is a bad game, because it was Final Fantasy. It's just that this series has meant so much to me, and I have enjoyed pretty much everything that has the Final Fantasy name on it, that something had to be down the bottom. And that something was Final Fantasy VII. Funnily enough, this remake has actually helped me to appreciate the game that much more. So it is now, having gone back to start playing Final Fantasy VII again, it's actually the original Final Fantasy VII, I mean, I actually am enjoying it more having played the remake. And the reason for all of that is, you can boil it down to the characters, really. I like my stories to be very character driven. And particularly with the Final Fantasy series, I like to have favourite characters, characters I can really identify with, characters I really care about, and therefore the drama and the action that happens to them actually has some poignancy. It actually seems to mean something, and I have some kind of emotional response to it, especially when, you know, times are bad and the characters go through bad periods. It helps to be able to empathise with what they're going through. And if you look at my favourite Final Fantasy games, such as Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy VI and VIII, all of those had characters that I really enjoyed on some level, whether it's one of the supplementary characters such as Selphie from Final Fantasy VIII, or Locke from Final Fantasy VI, or Riku from Final Fantasy X, or it's the main characters themselves such as Ash from Final Fantasy XII. it really helps if I have these characters that I can really care about, whose personalities that I enjoy, and all of that. Final Fantasy VII didn't have that originally for me. Cloud, Barrett, Tifa, Yuffie, and Aerith, the cast of characters they never really came together in such a way that I really identified with them, including that one very famous scene with Ares from the original, which I'm not going to spoil here in case somebody who's listening hasn't played it. But I just didn't connect with them, and I think the reason that I didn't connect with them was, firstly, the game looked so primitive that it was impossible to get a sense of the character from their actual design. Even looking at Final Fantasy VIII compared to VII, VIII had much more realistic looking characters and much more detailed, animation and so on, even though it was a PlayStation 1 game and looks primitive today. The step up from where Final Fantasy VII was just a bunch of messy blocks was quite significant. Whereas with the remake, obviously it's gorgeous, and you have the most amazing character models I think we've ever seen in a video game. So the effort that the developers put into that immediately made me connect with the characters more. But it was also to do with the actual way that the stories were told. In Final Fantasy VII Original, the narrative beats were really kind of one-line things, and while it was a game that was story-driven, it was also a game that was marked for its brevity. Whereas with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the developers have really gone to great lengths to build out deep stories with these characters and make it very cinematic. It's the transition from a video game being a video game narrative to a video game being a kind of more naturalistic, more authentic kind of cinematic story. And that transition has really helped me to connect with these characters. Funnily enough, it wasn't the main characters that I found myself getting really connected to with this playthrough of Final Fantasy VII. I certainly enjoyed them a lot more, and I thought that they were much better realised characters this time around. But it was actually 3 minor characters from the base game that I really found interesting. And you're seeing some of the base game footage on the screen in front of you now just to show you what it was like. But these 3 characters, who were Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie, were all super minor characters that only had a couple of words to say in the opening chapters of Final Fantasy VII, and then they kind of disappeared away from the game. They were little more than NPCs that you would talk to in a town once and never again. So I didn't even realise, for example, that Jessie was a female character when I played Final Fantasy VII. Her role within the game was so limited, and she was referred to so infrequently, and there was so little backstory for her that I actually didn't realise her gender. Obviously, because the game looks so primitive, that didn't help either. You'll see in a second that I come up to Jessie, and it's really hard to tell if she's meant to be a man or a woman. And that really, those characters you were never meant to connect with. But in Final Fantasy VII Remake, the developers have gone to great lengths to give huge backstories to all of these characters and really explain who they are. And you could be cynical about that and suggest that the reason that Square Enix did that was because Square Enix needed to expand out the Midgar section of Final Fantasy VII, because remember that this release that we're talking about here is only the first part of what will be a series of game releases, and that first part is just what happens in Midgar before the team escapes the city and then goes on the broader adventure. So you could be cynical and suggest that because Square Enix needed to pad out this section to make it a viable self-contained product, they've gone to some characters that were minor and decided to give them stories of their own and whatever. But while you could be cynical and say that, that really underplays just how much of a role that these characters have in this game, how much deeper the game feels as a result, and really how enjoyable the characters are themselves, because Square Enix has done an absolutely cracking job writing these characters. So I'll talk about Jessie right now because I absolutely love Jessie. I think she's an amazing character. She is probably my favourite Final Fantasy character of all, at least at the moment, and I really wish that she was either playable or had the chance of having her own game down the track as a side story or whatever, because I think she really deserves it. But what I say about Jessie also applies to Biggs and Wedge, because they're both also excellently rewritten characters. In the base Final Fantasy VII, Jessie is nothing more than a button pusher. She gives you the bomb that you're going to use in the opening chapter, and then helps you break some codes to get to the middle of the Mako reactor, which you're tasked with blowing up. That's the introduction to Final Fantasy VII. In Final Fantasy VII Remake, her role is still that within the organization, which is called Avalanche. Within the terrorist organization that you're a part of, called Avalanche, Jessie gives you the bomb, she helps you break the codes to get into the reactor and then blow it up. She even has the exact same scenes where she gets her foot trapped under some rubble as the reactor starts to explode, and after that happens she has a moral conscious kind of dilemma where she questions whether what she's doing is the right thing given how much destruction she's causing. On that level, that's great. That is just taking the character model right there on the screen and HDing it to the maximum. But there's a lot more to Jessie in the new game, which is where her appeal as a character comes through. Firstly, she's not just saying a couple of stupid lines about hacking a bit of equipment, or, you know, are we doing the right thing because we're blowing up these reactors. She has this real full personality this time around. She's quite flirtatious, but also a very confident woman. So she is actually kind of the equal to both Aerith and Tifa in that regard. Cloud has this weird kind of three-woman harem thing going throughout the entire game, where he's not particularly interested in any of them, but he also kind of is. And each of those girls has their own way of playing him with that. And they're all quite playful, vibrant, vivacious characters in their own way. And, you know, in that regards, Jessie is every bit the equal to the other two major characters within the plot. She also has entire chapters that are actually dedicated to her. And I'm going to see if I can talk about this stuff without getting too spoilery, but basically there's an entire section of the game which takes quite a significant amount of time, where you need to travel with Jessie to her parents' home to help her out with a task. And in doing so, you find out an awful lot about her backstory, about the relationship she has with her parents, about the reason that she's joined Avalanche in the first place, about what really motivates her, and why she takes all of this quite, you know, personally, and why it's so serious to her. So that's all very good and very well written backstory. And she has a very talented voice actress, especially in the Japanese voice track. She's got a top level actress doing her lines, and she comes across as a very convincing, very likable character. And her story is actually quite serious, but she also tends to be in the moments which are quite, you know, light, because she's not involved in the actual combat, because she's not a playable character. Her role is very narrative driven, so it tends to be the moments which are less action based and more kind of personality and world setting based. Now, given that Final Fantasy VII Remake, as in the first chapter which we're playing now, doesn't have all the characters that the full game on the original PlayStation ended up having, it was important to come up with new characters. So, you know, you don't have Vincent, for example, who was a very popular character from Final Fantasy VII Original. He doesn't show up till much later on, neither does Yuffie, and several other major characters that are very popular don't come until later. So Square Enix needed to find new characters that would be enjoyable and people could really kind of get along with. They've done that in a couple of ways. There's a couple of new characters that they've introduced, and I don't think that those new characters are so good as an overall thing. You're about to see one right here. He's this kind of rival soldier to Cloud, and he's a Yahoo with a motorbike, and he's kind of a boss character. There's also a kind of side story that features a character that you rescue early on, and he's a bit of a loser and not particularly enjoyable. And you can see the different heritage in those characters. So as simple as Jessie's character, for example, was from the original Final Fantasy, it was there, and Square Enix needed to do something to maintain a continuity between the original game and this game, where they've come up with completely original characters, or at least characters that were so minor from the original Final Fantasy that I don't remember them from the last time I played the game in full. That's where they've lost the plot a little bit with the characterization. There's still quite a few enjoyable new characters as well, but I think that the core of the game is really about seeing your favorite characters, and characters that you would not have expected to be your favorite, from the original game reimagined. The other thing that I find absolutely fascinating about Jessie's expanded character and role within Final Fantasy VII Remake is just how seamlessly it fits in with what was already there in Final Fantasy VII. And I think that has to do with how limited Final Fantasy VII actually is. If you go back and play it now, aside from Cloud, Sephiroth and Aerith's story, there's not that much to what happens in Final Fantasy VII. All the characters, really. They join your party and they help out in a fight, and they all have short kind of stories of their own, but it's never really expanded upon to the point where you'd say, yeah, that's a major character. Barrett is the token angry guy, and once you get through the early chapter of the game where he's kind of the one that's hired Cloud to help with his eco-terrorism campaign, he really fades into the background of that game. Whereas with this one, he has an expanded story, and he continues to be a very important character in terms of his own character deep into the story this time around. Well, the whole way through, really. The same goes for Jessie, Biggs and Wedge. They were just single lines. So really, there wasn't too much to work with there. And that gave Square Enix a very open book in terms of creativity and what they could do with these characters. All they needed to do was make sure that their relationship to Cloud remained, and in that sense, as agents of Avalanche, all you needed to do was make sure that everything they did was still framed within missions for Avalanche, and that's how the relationship with Cloud continues to pan out. And they have done that. The one mission where you learn a lot about Jessie's backstory, that still has to do with Avalanche as an organization. So yeah, it's very clever writing, and I think that Final Fantasy VII Remake shouldn't be seen as a replacement to the existing game, because a lot of remakes are there because the developer has decided that the original game is no longer relevant and or is just too difficult to play for modern audiences, so they decide to fix it effectively. And in trying to fix it, they keep the game to the original as closely as possible. I don't think that's what's happened with this remake. I think what Square Enix has done has instead been to create something complementary to the original game. So what really happens in this Final Fantasy VII Remake is that you have the base game, which you loved, Final Fantasy VII, and then you have this opportunity to learn more about it within the context of a retelling of the base story. All that base story stuff is still there, but now you have a chance to learn more about the world. You have a chance to kind of look up at the sky and see the overhanging plates when you're in the slums, and just be intimidated by that, which the game wanted you to be, but the graphical engine at the time was too limited to really allow that to happen. Now you can have that. And now you can get to know all these other characters and get a sense that this is a world. It's not just Cloud's story. It's more about the kind of the whole world events and the implications of that for the entire world. So Final Fantasy VII Remake ends up feeling quite a lot more epic than the original, which was a 3-disc, long game at the time. This first chapter is shorter in the sense that you won't take as long to play the whole thing as you did the original, but it is also much more substantial and deeper and richer. And I think that while this game will certainly get some criticism from people, it's important to remember that. I think a lot of people that will criticize this game probably haven't played Final Fantasy VII for a while. If they did, they'd go back and they'd realize that there's a lot missing from Final Fantasy VII and a lot of room to expand on it, which is what Square Enix has done. They've expanded on the base game. And I really love Jessie. I just love her so much. She's such an amazing character. And while I can't talk about what happens to her because that happens deep in the game and that would be spoiler territory, I can tell you that I definitely cared. I cared a lot about all of these characters from the moment I kind of met them in this game, and it really stayed with me. For me, Final Fantasy, it's a series that I've been playing ever since I was a kid. Literally, I've been playing Final Fantasy for... I think the first one I played was Final Fantasy IV, and that was when it was new. So this is a series that I have a long heritage with, and there are certain qualities that I like to see in my Final Fantasy games. I like to see the traditional fantasy elements, such as the chocobos, the moogles, the summons, and I like those summons to be kind of classical summons like Final Fantasy IV rather than Final Fantasy XV's interpretation of them. And I feel like Final Fantasy has really lost its way with me a little bit in recent years. Final Fantasy XV I thought was a very fine game, and I enjoyed it a great deal as a game, but I didn't get the sense that it was a Final Fantasy to me. What the developers were trying to do with it seemed to be pushing the game in a direction that wasn't quite as resonant with me. And Final Fantasy XIII is much the same. I really love that trilogy, and I will be one of the few people that defend it to the death, and I'm still waiting for the Switch port of the trilogy so I can enjoy them again. I will play them all again in a heartbeat, but they were also a push away from what Final Fantasy was to me. For me, the last Final Fantasy game that was a genuine, true, down-to-earth, not MMO, classical Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy XII, which was also an amazing game. And I've been waiting for Square Enix to find some excuse to go back to that style and just give the traditional fans of the series something. And I think that this is a genuine effort at it. I feel like even with that kind of action combat system, which if you read my review is not really that much of an action combat system, it has an ebb and flow which is very turn-based in feel. Even with that, this game still has the traditional Final Fantasy feel about it, this epic fantasy which is a focus on characters and a team of people coming together to achieve something, without all the kind of the modern nonsense that goes into a lot of these games. And it has that traditional kind of fantasy feel rather than a purely science fiction thing, where it is all about kind of swords and sorcery rather than swords and guns or science fiction stuff, which I also feel has become more of a thing with Final Fantasy. So yeah, this game was a return to form for me with Square Enix and the series, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what happens with the next chapter. The main reason for it being such a success is just the way that it does its characters, and I did not expect that going in. I was really unsure about this game at first. I didn't even try the demo because I was so nervous about playing this game because it was kind of a last straw potentially. If they ruined this, then that was it. But they didn't, and I'm more than happy to say that my expectations for this game were wrong, and I've really enjoyed it. So yeah, give it a go. I'd be very keen on hearing your thoughts about it when you get a chance to play it, because it is going to be controversial, but hopefully enough people out there really enjoy it that Square Enix can say mission achieved and a new generation of people can enjoy Final Fantasy VII. Thanks as always for watching this video. I know it was a long one. Please like and subscribe. If you enjoy them, please do back me on Patreon so you can, if you wanted to, support me directly. And please do have a read of the review. It's a long one, but it goes in depth with a lot of stuff I didn't discuss here. See you at the next video.